striving to bring there's more than two sides, but at least two sides together for well over a decade, as you recount in your book, which I recommend to everyone, by the way. It's an excellent book, a very wonderful retelling of all that Ken has been doing over recent years. It raises this issue of is anti-Zionism equal to the same thing as anti-Semitism, which has now become part of the background of this divisiveness. How do we protect academic freedom and freedom of speech? And the issue, I think, of conflation of speech and non-speech action. So all those issues come out in this context. And the particular focus that Ken has in his book, and it's a focus for all of us, is on the campuses, of course, and the colleges, where this seems to these issues manifest themselves in a very strong way and have been manifesting themselves for a long time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ken, who will talk about his new book and talk about all these issues and ideas. And then we will open it up for questions. In the meantime, there is a chat box, and you can, at the bottom of your screen, and you can post questions there. Alyssa will keep track of those questions, and we'll circle back to them after Ken's presentation. So Ken, welcome, and the platform is yours.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you for the gracious invitation. It's a pleasure to see some old friends and some other people who I know, in passing over the years. So it's a pleasure to spend some time with you. As Steve asked, I'm going to spend about 40 minutes talking about a number of issues. And again, it's mostly focused on the campus, but there's a larger frame to it. For this audience, I'm also going to take a little bit of a deep dive into some of the legal issues, yes, particularly Title VI and the executive order. So I will talk about that a little bit later in my remarks. But wherever you want the conversation to go, I'm happy to go there with you at the end. The issues here really are difficult about how do we think about this conflict? How do we anticipate it should be approached on campus? How is it being approached on campus? And as Steve was alluding to, the larger questions is how to have rational discussions about the Israel-Palestine conflict and why it's so difficult to do so, both inside the community and outside the community. And hopefully one of the takeaways from the book is how to have more rational conversations about this. So what I'm going to do is to spend part of my remarks, as Steve was saying, that I've been dealing with these issues for a long time. I have, and part of the book goes through those stories to elicit some of the principles that I want to share with you about how to think about this. So I really want to start in the same way where I started the book, because even though it's not a campus vignette, it's illuminating the challenges of the issue. So I start out with a place actually that I took Richard to many years ago, Spokane, Washington, where there was a history. Some of you will remember that the Aryan nations was a big deal. There's the largest neo-Nazi group at the time, the 80s, the 90s, and so forth. It was responsible for the assassination of a Jewish talk show host, Alan Berg. Buford Furrow, who you may recall was the Aryan Nations guy who shot up the Jewish Community Center in Los Angeles in 1999, came from there. If you were Jewish in that community, you saw evidence of some of the group's work, even on things like going into a store and buying Hanukkah gift wrap. It was a while people were finding razor blades inside. The group firebombed a parish priest that was speaking out against them. And so it was a great disruptor there. And it was shut down, the lawsuit brought by the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2001, but the real work against it for decades was based by largely two groups in Spokane, although there were other groups involved too. One was the Jewish community, which is small but active, and the other was a peace and justice group. And together they did a lot of commendable things to push back against the impact of the Aryan nations in the community. And the danger, even after the lawsuit, and the closing down of the Aryan nations was very clear. There was a few years ago a remote-controlled bomb put in a backpack on the Martin Luther King Day parade route. It was filled with fishing weights soaked in anticoagulants found in rat poison. There were children on that march. It got diffused, thankfully. If you go to Spokane, which I did a year and a half ago, you still see white power leaflets on lampposts downtown. So the dangers are still there, even though the group isn't. But for 8 years, the Jewish community and the Peace and Justice group weren't working together. They weren't speaking to each other. They wouldn't even be in coalitions if the other group was there. And what was the background to it? The background was that the Peace and Justice group had a static web page supporting boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel. So you have this abstract problem thousands of miles away that were preventing people on the ground from working on, the clear dangers to them and their families. And that's nuts, right? So how do we, we can understand that dynamic between the two, but how do we understand the larger problem and the challenges to get around that? So that's where we're going to start, and that's where I'm going to end up with the talk today too. So in terms of my background, I grew up in the 50s and 60s in New York. I was very involved in civil rights issues. I became a lawyer because of them. I moved to Portland, Oregon in the mid-70s to go to law school. I started to practice. I was involved in representing leadership of the American Indian movement, some of the last Vietnam era protesters, the homeless, and so forth. So I was very involved in the progressive community in Portland, but Portland then, like now, had that flavor, the progressive groups, and also had very far-right, racist, anti-Semitic, white supremacist group. There was a group called the Posse Comitatus that was a precursor to the 90s militia. That was really where I first saw organized anti-Semitism. These were folks that were handing out leaflets about Jewish conspiracy and so forth. And the reason I mention that is that in 1982, I started going to protest against the Lebanon war. I thought it was ill-advised, but then I started seeing some of the people with whom I was in a community of progressives, including lawyers, some of the same things that the Posse Comitatus was talking about: Jewish conspiracy, Jewish control of the media, Jewish control of government, seeing through that anti-Semitic lens and understanding of what was happening in Lebanon. So that was a struggle for me, what to do about it. I started writing about that. I left a group called the National Lawyers Guild, which is where all the progressive lawyers that were doing the work for AIM and other groups were. And it was all over how they were dealing with anti-Semitism in the Israel groups, and struggling to how to respond to this effectively, because I was writing a lot for the local papers, but I was really just angry and self-righteous and not convincing anybody. So flip forward a few years, I started working in the American Jewish Committee. As Richard knows, he was very welcoming when I started, and we worked together again for a long time. I worked there between '89 and 2014. And the campus was one of my responsibilities. It wasn't just anti-Semitism, but because you can't just deal with anti-Semitism isolated on the campus. When you're dealing with racism, bigotry, and discrimination, you have to articulate structures and systems that apply to everybody, not just Jewish students. So that was part of what I did. And the first project was something called a manual on bigotry on campus. I trained about 200 college presidents about how to approach it. It was informed by a lot of discussions with college presidents that we had collected around the AJC, particularly Bob Hess of Brooklyn College, but many others as well. And there were some lessons from that. This is at a time, you may recall, that the great push was, let's have hate speech codes. The University of Michigan and a number of other places had codes of language that get you in trouble on a campus if you spoke them. There were a lot of problems with those, and I can answer those in questions and answers, but let me just point out one that to me was the most significant because it applies to other aspects of this issue too. There are lots to do about issues of anti-Semitism and bigotry on campus, things from surveys and looking at curriculum and looking at training and so forth. But when you define the answer as we're going to have a hate speech code that's going to limit speech and define it in very crystal clear ways, what that does is it disempowers all these other things that are actually more complex and more expensive to do, and gives administrators and others an out not to do them because there's this fancy, rule that we can cut and paste and that will take care of the problem. So all those other things disappear. So one of the things that I learned in terms of putting together that Bigotry on Campus program, and from some of the college presidents with whom I work, that when you're going to deal with any issue of bigotry on campus, anti-Semitism included, you have to build into the foundation respect for core principles of the academy, namely free speech and academic freedom. If you have to try to explain them away or actually diminish them, they're not programs or policies that are actually going to have the effect that you desire on a campus. So let me flip forward again a couple of vignettes. There's, post-2000, after the beginning of the Second Intifada and the Durban Conference, there was an anti-Semitic orgy in South Africa. In 2001, we started seeing petitions on college campuses calling for divestment. And that really was the beginning of a lot of what we're seeing now in terms of the Israel-Palestine issue on campus. Let me just segue for a second, and then I'll get back to 2002, but it's an opportunity here to put some things in perspective. The petition started in February 2002, where 18 years later, not one college is divested from companies in Israel, not one. Most campuses, Israel is not an issue. There are about 4,000 campuses in the United States. In a recent year, 149 of them had anti-Israel programs. And every year, if you count the pro-Israel programs and the anti-Israel programs, the pro-Israel programs outnumber the anti-Israel ones about a 2-to-1 margin. There have been disruptions of pro-Israel speakers. I find them, reprehensible and a violation of academic freedom. But they're not as ubiquitous as people would suggest. Between 2010 and 2019, there were 117 disruptions, and all but 16 programs were able to be completed. And that was on 12 campuses total. So 12 campuses, 117 incidents, 16 programs not being able to complete it over a decade with 4,000 campuses in the United States is not ubiquitous. It's a problem, but it's not huge. Anyway, so let me flip back to 2002. So we started seeing these petitions, and we started seeing some attacks on things that were related to Israel and Zionism on campus. There was an attack on the Hillel building in Berkeley. There was a riot when Benjamin Netanyahu spoke at Concordia in Montreal. And one of the things that Richard remembers, very well, I'm sure, is that AJC said, okay, what do we do about this? We convened a bunch of college presidents, and there was a statement that was put out that affirmed, that over 400 college presidents signed on to, that affirmed their obligation as college presidents to maintain a university that was open to ideas and against harassment. Again, the cornerstone of that was promoting free speech and academic freedom, and the university is a cherished space, and their responsibility to not let riots happen and attacks like that. Flip forward a couple of more years. There was remember in 2007, the University and College Union in the UK passed a resolution that was promoting a boycott of Israeli academic institutions. And there were some Jewish groups, and I understand the instinct, the ADL in particular, was saying, well, we have to consider a counter boycott of British academic institutions. Well, think about that for a moment. The major argument against the academic boycott is that it violates academic freedom. Ideas should be evaluated on their merit, not on the nationality of the person who's promoting the ideas. If we started a counter boycott, you would have had a situation where you're giving away the best argument and change it to who should be boycotted. So Lee Bollinger, and I tell the more detailed story in the book, but Lee Bollinger put out a statement that AJC then promoted and had over 400 college presidents signing on to that too, which is not an easy thing, getting college presidents to sign on to another president's statement, but it basically said this: if the British Union was determined to divide the academy into two, to Israeli academics who should be shunned and everybody else, then count Columbia and all these other institutions as Israeli. So what did it do? It affirmed academic freedom. I can guarantee you, if we had a counter boycott, we're going to boycott British academic institutions, we had zero presidents signing on. But affirming academic freedom and rejecting the boycott was it was labor intensive, but a relatively easy thing to do because it underscored academic freedom and its importance. So that's one principle I want you to come away with here. If we're going to do something about the campus, it has to be, aligned with academic freedom. I'm going to jump here into a little bit about the executive order because I know this audience is interested in it. And let me give you the background to it in some detail. Again, it goes back to the early 2000s. You may recall there was, again, at the time of the Second Intifada, there were attacks really spiking worldwide against Jews and Jewish-linked property, particularly in Western Europe, in the UK and France and elsewhere. And there was a group called the European Monitoring Center that's now part of the Fundamental Rights Agency, but then as now, the group had the task of monitoring what was happening in terms of racism, discrimination, xenophobia, and so forth. And it put out a report in 2004 that had a couple of key points in addition to who it was finding was responsible for what was happening on the ground. One is it pointed out a real problem. You were asking people all over Europe, in Bratislava, in Paris, in Berlin, and elsewhere, to put together reports about manifestations of anti-Semitism, but there was no real guidance, there was no definition. How do you tell people to look for a common set of things to know what to include into their reports? Second thing was that, and this I found really troubling, so I said, okay, well, let's figure out, sort of a marker of a possible definition. And they said it was a series of stereotypes about Jews, leaving aside why that's intellectually problematic. What I found most difficult about it is I thought it was a political subterfuge because it wanted to think about how do you deal with a Jew on the streets of Paris that's attacked as a stand-in for an Israeli. Is that anti-Semitism or is that not anti-Semitism? And they concluded, well, if this person had these sets of stereotypes and applied them to Israelis and reapplied them to the French Jew who was in front of them, that's anti-Semitism. But if they were upset at Israeli policy and lashed out at the Jew in front of them, that's not anti-Semitism, lamentable as it might be. And I'm thinking, wait a minute, somebody in the South hangs a black person on the tree because they think blacks are shiftless and lazy, that's racism. But if they're upset at the Civil Rights Act being passed or Martin Luther King Day speech, they're not, that's not racism. So a colleague, Andy Baker, and I, and Richard, I know, was involved, there's a lot of AJC colleagues and a lot of others, worked with the EUMC to put together a working definition. I was the lead drafter, a lot of other people had their hands in it. It was intended largely, although not exclusively, for this particular task of how do you catalog these things. And there were some examples about Israel put in the definition, holding all Jews responsible for Israel, equating the actions of the Israelis to the Nazis. And there was also assertion of basically anti-Zionism, saying Jews don't have a right to self-determination. It's a racist enterprise to believe so. And there were reasons for putting that in. I had a colleague named Mike Wine, some of you might remember, who was from the Community Security Trust. And I remember vividly at a conference him holding up one graph of the number of attacks on Jews and another graph of basically the anti-Zionist level of articles in the UK press, and could almost superimpose one over the other. So to take a temperature across borders, across time, that was an important thing to include in that definition. So that's how the definition came about. So put that aside for 1 second, because we're going to marry it to another concept in a second, and you'll see where the problems are with the executive order, in my view. In 2010, the Department of Education put out a Dear Colleague letter that I thought was very important. AJC supported it. I know Richard, worked on this, and it was absolutely right. There was a question because Title VI didn't include religion. What do you do with Jews and anti-Semitism on a campus? And the letter said that Jews and Sikhs and Muslims as ethnicities should be covered under Title VI. And that's important, right? So because Title VI outlaws harassment, which encompasses both different treatment and the existence of a racially hostile environment, meaning the offending conduct is so severe and pervasive that in order to continue their education, a student has to suffer an educational environment that a reasonable person would consider intimidating, hostile, or abusive. And it should protect Jewish students. And in fact, I was complaining for a group of high school students in the Binghamton, New York area where there was a Kick a Jew Day and they had swastikas put on their desks and so forth. And the school district didn't do much, and the Department of Education investigated and found a violation. There was a consent. Now, the potential remedy for a Title VI violation is theoretically draconian. It could be losing of all federal funding. And in that case, a school would basically have to close. So it really is an important incentive to get people to not allow such a type of abusive behavior. But what happened at the end of 2010, 2011, you started having some groups on the Jewish right, Zionist Organization of America, and some others that had this great idea. Let's marry the definition with its examples to Title VI. And they started bringing a bunch of cases, some of which also talked about things like spitting and other discriminatory things that I thought were proper, but they were saturated with examples that were complained about things that were purely speech which I might find offensive and disagree with, but purely expression. Programs about, quote, the occupation, texts that they said were unambiguously one-sided and anti-Israel. A program called Understanding Gaza that was one-sided, and it said Jewish students were left emotionally and intellectually threatened. A program called Arabs in the Holocaust, which claimed, and they said this violated the definition, that it was a tragedy, the creation of Israel for Palestinian Arabs, bringing in speakers, other programs about the occupations and so forth. So what happened? All the lawsuits failed. Then they tried to get the University of California to adopt the definition. They didn't. Then they tried legislation, which I testified against, and it was very interesting. If you think about it, that the people that were testifying for it were basically the Jewish organizations, the people that were against it. President of PEN America, who's Jewish, the Association of Jewish Studies president, and so forth. But the legislation failed. And then the executive order was signed that basically says you have to consider the definition when you're considering one of these Title VI cases involving alleged anti-Semitism. I can get more in the question and answer period of why I find that problematic, but I'll give you a couple of things to consider now, and then we can get back to that later. One is, I didn't see a single college president, let alone 400 of them, saying that we need this executive order. I think to the extent that any of them had the bravery to speak out about it, they were opposed, and you certainly saw Jewish studies professors against this. Secondly, if you think about parallels, we don't have a standard definition of any other type of thing. Racism isn't covered in Title VI. Would you put at the present moment somebody who says we should keep a statue of a Confederate general as an example of racism that has to be considered in a Title VI case? That's the parallel here. It prioritizes and diminishes certain speech. And to see the implication, the Simon Wiesenthal Center actually applauded the application of the definition in the UK, where there was a group of students that were going to do an Israel Apartheid Week event. As much as I don't like Israel Apartheid Week, that's expression, and they applauded the law there to not allow that event, and they said the same thing should happen here. It shouldn't be allowed. So what's propelling a lot of this? Part of it, I think, is a belief, and you saw this in some of the lawsuits and some of what I mentioned to you, the idea that Jewish students should be protected from hearing such expressions. that they're somehow fragile if they hear things that will disturb them about Israel, and things that would disturb, I suspect, most of the people in this audience, including me. But I'd argue the other side, that campuses in particular are a place where students should be disturbed by ideas. I sent 2 kids to college, spent a hell of a lot of money. If they're not at a place where they get disturbed by ideas and can't figure out how to think about things when they're disturbed by ideas, it's a hell of a lot of money wasted. That's one of the premises of the book, that this is a great issue in which to teach critical thinking and how to deal with ideas that disturb you to the core. The second aspect of this that's sort of unique in the book is how human beings process information and think about things when their identity is tethered to an issue of perceived social justice or injustice, which plays out spectacularly on the Israel-Palestine debate. Why and there are lots of, again, I won't bore you with all the social science and the brain science, but there's a lot of things that suggest that when we get into those buckets where our identity feels threatened, that we crave certainty. We'd like to see more of an us and them and define the world with very sharp edges that way. It becomes easier to understand the world. Jonathan Haidt, who's a social psychologist who I respect a lot and quoted in the book, said that when people see things in such moral terms, morality, he said, both binds, it connects people together, they feel as part of a community in a struggle, and it also blinds them to things as well. And I think that's a lot of truth in that. Again, we see the power of symbols in debates like this. Now we see all this about the Confederate flag and so forth, right? On the campus, we see the Israeli flag. It's a symbol too. And on both sides, we see some pro-Palestinian students ripping it down, and we see pro-Israel students literally draping themselves into it. So, to think about this issue, I think it's important to take a deep dive into how we think and we feel, again, when our identity is tethered to an issue of perceived social justice. And our book, the book looks at examples in both camps are in this sort of extremist way of thinking. I have examples on each side calling the other side Nazis. There's nothing worse you can be called, but both sides do that. They try to look at it that way rather than having some, which I'll talk about in a second, some capacity to think a little bit larger and imagination for empathy. I think what we need to do is first to stop trying to censor the other side. The pro-Palestinian side does it, as I mentioned, by disrupting speeches and academic boycotts, and blacklists. The pro-Israel side also has a blacklist, Canary Mission, and we tend to do it by emails, phone calls, and now laws. And I think that's a dereliction of some of the principles I was talking about at the beginning. You have to promote academic freedom as opposed to saying confronters, shut out the other side from saying things, even if we find them disturbing. I think we have to also embrace the complexity. Richard remembers as well as I that one of the things that I think we both really liked about AJC over the years, we thought was really smart, was Project Interchange. It was a group that took leaders, journalists, members of Congress, whatever, to Israel and showed them, at least back in the day, people from all different sides. And they came back saying, this is more complex than I thought, which is what you wanted. You didn't want them to, become ardent Zionists or whatever. They came and understood this is not as simple as people are saying. It's oppressor and oppressed, okay? So you need to embrace the complexity. And I want to read one example from the book, which I've used in trainings, which I think, encompasses a lot of this, okay? So what I talk about is the claim that Israelis are settler colonialists. And I write, on July 4th, 2018, the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel wrote to the Iroquois Confederacy, Native nations from New York and Canada, urging them to boycott the World Championship of Lacrosse, a game natives invented and that Iroquois introduced to early American settlers, a game they continue to excel at and is important to their culture. The request stated in part, as indigenous peoples, we have both seen our traditional lands colonized, our people ethnically cleansed and massacred by colonial settlers. This year marks 70 years of Israeli dispossession of Palestinians, which began with what we call the Nakba or catastrophe. In the years surrounding Israel's establishment on our homeland in 1948, pre- and post-state Israeli forces premeditatively drove out the majority of the indigenous people of Palestine and destroyed more than 500 of our villages and homes. And I write, contrast this language with this passage of an essay by Judea Pearl, a noted academic and the father of Daniel Pearl, the Wall Street Journal reporter who was beheaded by terrorists in Pakistan in 2002. It is not surprising, Pearl wrote, that misrepresenting Israel as a, quote, white settler colonialist society has become a cornerstone of BDS ideology and propaganda. He asked those who read such claims to, quote, ask themselves if they can recall any of the following. One case of white settlers moving into a country they perceive to be the birthplace of their history. One case of white settlers speaking a language spoken in the land before the language spoken by its contemporary residents. One case of settlers whose holidays commemorated the historical events in the land to which they moved, not the lands from which they came. One case of settlers who did not name towns like New York, New Amsterdam, and New Wales. Israeli towns are not named New Warsaw, New Berlin, or New Baghdad, but after names by which those towns were known in ancient times. One case of settlers who narrated their homecoming journey for 80 generations in poetry, prose, lore, and daily prayers. And I conclude the reality is that Israel isn't like settler colonial states in many ways, but in other ways it is. Proponents on each side seem blind to the complexities, choosing to highlight either the differences or similarities, depending on which suits their black, white, good, bad, us, them argument, or perhaps as Michael Hogue, who's a scholar I cited in an earlier part, as his colleagues posit, depending on which one makes them feel more, quote, certain. As scholar Zeth and Ziska says, quote, real history is the ability to navigate all these views at once. The rest is communal advocacy. So I think promoting that this is complex and how to teach about it is one of the things that we need to do on a campus. There are other things too. I think that we need to have more classes on anti-Semitism. I've taught, two at Bard over the years. I can tell you that by the time you get into the Israel Zionism issue, about 2/3 of the way through the class, and people have an understanding of anti-Semitism, it becomes a much easier conversation to have. Another is the importance of free speech. We live in an era where there's, again, a view not just of Jewish students, the students fragile, that we have to somehow diminish students' ability to speak. I think we have to really teach the importance of speech, and I have a lot of that in the book too. I'm happy to expand upon that if you want questions and answers. You have to model the campus as a place for difficult discussions, examining all views, not just the correct ones. I've challenged Jewish organizations to bring in pro-Palestinian speakers. I just did that on an AEN call the other day. Instead of just hearing people that are criticizing BDS, why not bring in a respected pro-BDS person and deal with their primary sources, and then engage with, and conversely, they should have people from, the David Harrises of the world and the Jonathan Greenblatt speak in front of their audience. I don't think it's a risk that either side is going to take, but it would model on a campus to have reasonable discussions. And I think we have to insist on functional empathy. Imagine how you would feel if you were born differently. In this case, for most, all of us who are Jewish, imagine how you were born Palestinian. I think it's something that we're seeing today in the white support for the Black Lives Matter movement, but I think it's an important principle to have as well. There are other things to be done too. There's a wonderful model class that that I love, that I really wish would happen on many campuses. It happened at the University of Maryland, it happened at a few other places. A woman named Natasha Gill, who developed this. It's called the Struggle for Palestine game. And basically I found out about it because you may remember sort of odd fact a few years ago that there was a Pakistani Muslim woman who became the head of the J Street student group, J Street U. That was an unusual fact. She was in the class in the University of Maryland that Paul Sham taught, and the class is designed to look at the Israel-Palestine conflict, Israel-Arab conflict from the 1880s, stopping in the late 30s. So before the Holocaust, before the declaration of the state, before the Nakba, before 67, before contemporary things, the guts of the conflict. And half of the class, the students have to do primary research and do a simulation where they faithfully represent somebody who was a participant in the appeal commission, whether it was one of the commissioners or one of the Jews or Arabs who participated. Amna spent, I forget, it was 6 or 8 weeks in the skin of David Ben-Gurion. And when I asked her about that experience, she said, "You think that was weird?" I had an Israeli classmate who had to be at the Mufti, and as much of a pain in the butt as he was, the person on my side who was the Jabotinsky figure was even more difficult to deal. So that's real education. I mean, and Natasha tells me that students would come in saying, "Gee, we're going to figure out how the Israel-Palestine conflict could have been solved," and they come out of it thinking, "Gee, 80 years later, we know why it hasn't yet been solved," and that's what education should do. No one on campus is going to solve the problem, but you can use it to increase critical thinking. And I'm going to end here by looping back to that story where I started out about Spokane, because, as I said, having the divide of people that want to work together on really more important issues for their community, was pressing, and they realized there that they had a problem. So they wanted a way forward. They invited me to come in, and 40 people that were specifically invited, the mayor, the police chief, people from the different communities. I gave them 80 pages of text to read, including some of the material on hate studies and how to think about us versus them. And it was productive. They're now working together. They're now talking together. It opened up opportunities inside the Jewish community where people felt their position on Israel was stopping them from going to synagogue, and it opened up the capacity for them to participate. And again, Spokane is a small community. There's like one major synagogue, which they refer to as Reconservadox, because it has to accommodate everybody. But it wasn't accommodating people that had different views on Israel, and now it is. And at the end of that day of being there, I'll share 2 comments to you, and then I'll stop. I was impressed that one of the people that was in the pro-BDS camp came up to me and said, "I never really thought about it before, but now understanding Jewish history and the boycott of Jews, why the idea of boycotts against something Jewish like Israel really rankles to the core. I never thought about that before." And there was a person who was, I don't remember if he was a board member of AIPAC, but very involved, who sort of took my point when I said, and I'm against BDS, and I can explain why, but I related in the course of that day that I was debating a pro-BDS Palestinian academic a few years ago, and he had a point that had to be engaged. He said, "Look, at the Second Intifada, everybody was saying, find a way to make your case that's nonviolent. And whatever else we can say about BDS, it's nonviolent." So, that has to be engaged too. So those are the main points, and if I have to underscore it, we're going to do something on this issue. It has to have an undergirding of free speech, academic freedom, and there's an opportunity to use it to open up discussions not only inside the Jewish community, but between communities, and especially on a campus to teach students how to think. So I'm done. Questions?
All right, well, I think Steve's question is first, so.
Okay, as it should be.
Not necessarily. My question was, what is your particular objection to the revised language in the latest executive order under Title VI? So, but I want to add something else that maybe rumor, I don't know, but I've heard it several times, and that is, as you pointed out, Title VI does not include religion,
right,
as one of the grounds for discrimination, for a finding of discrimination on the basis of religion among race and so forth. And I heard from someone who was involved in the original drafting of Title VI that one of the reasons it never included religion was because there were objections from Jewish institutions, Jewish colleges, yeshivas, and so forth, who were getting federal funding, who might get federal funding, and did not want to have constraints on their hiring practices or other practices It could be based on religion. So,
Good. And on that second question, I think that's true, but Richard Fulton is a real maven on this, on church-state issues and so forth. So I would defer to him if he wanted to comment on the legislative history of the original Civil Rights Act. But I believe you're correct in saying that. In terms of the language, my problem isn't the particular definition. My problem is having a definition that's enshrined this way, that's prioritized. One of the things I talked about in my congressional testimony was that there have been harassment of Jewish students who are in the pro-Palestinian camp. And I think it happens less, but it does happen. They've been called cop-outs, they've been called traitors, they've been told they're not Jewish, so it prioritizes certain language. And there is a church-state problem in this issue that I find troubling, and it's this. As Jared Kushner wrote in his op-ed in the New York Times right after the executive order, that the administration takes the position that anti-Zionism is equated to anti-Semitism. And so I point on the book, sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. But it says it's a carte blanche rule, okay? There's a debate inside the Jewish community about how Jewish identity is related to support for the existence of Israel. And, if you think about it, there are Jewish groups that have a theological objection. Satmars are anti-Zionists, right? But we still see them inside the fold. There are a lot of kids who, this again isn't data-driven, but anecdotally, I've met a lot of young people whose actually parents or grandparents are active in ADL or AJC who are active in If Not Now. And their view of the conflict and, is driven not only by ideology, but by theology and the idea of what being Jewish means in terms of how you treat the stranger, how you treat Palestine. So they may have, I may disagree with them in terms of their conclusions, but they have a theologically based objection to Zionism. And I don't know inside the Jewish community how that debate about whether being Jewish today requires a particular stance about Israel. I don't know how it can be decided. I don't know, who should decide. I don't know. I don't like, the government basically deciding that. And for this purpose, it has made that determination using the definition that basically prioritizes anti-Zionism as a form of anti-Semitism. Again, I find that to be problematic. And again, but any issue of bigotry in law or in general ways of thinking about it, I always do the sort of cut and paste. What if a different group were involved with the same rules apply? And that's why I have a problem. There's no other group where it has a definition of things that are purely political speech that would be indicia in the Title VI case to prioritize certain cases of alleged bigotry. And I think that's a dangerous path to go down.
Could I?
yes,
So it was invoked. Maybe I can just jump in.
Please,
Yeah.
please do.
Richard.
So first of all, your history is about Title VI is mostly right. I mean, it is right. It's of course more complicated than that. And the problem was when Title VI was enacted, it was clear that to apply to religion, to apply the prohibition of discrimination to religion in the same way that's applied to race or sex or national origin would in fact mean that religiously affiliated universities like Yeshiva University, Catholic University, many others would not be eligible for funds, or they would have to change, they would not be able to say we want to hire a Catholic professor to teach Catholic theology, which would have been an absurd result. And so as a result of that, religion was not included, and it left, when the Department of Education was approached about cases of anti-Semitism, it was without jurisdiction to respond to clear cases of discrimination and harassment that were being directed at Jewish students. So AJC, I played a large role in getting the Department of Education to adopt that guidance in 2010. But it was following, that guidance already followed on policy that was being explored in the Bush administration. So you had bipartisan support for the notion that when Jews are targeted not because they're lighting Shabbos candles, but because have share a common ancestry, which is really sort of the classic definition of Nazi perspective on who Jews are. That's an act of discrimination, and it doesn't relate to how Jews see ourselves even because there's disputes not only about Zionism, but are we a race, are we a nationality, are we a religion, are we all of the above? Those conversations go on all the time, but that's not the point here. The point is that somebody is attacking Jews because they have that sense of who Jews are, and on that basis, they ought to be subject to Title VI's prohibitions, and Jewish students ought to be protected. So that was the theory behind all that. So having said that, I want to, and I don't think that the executive order does much more than that. And so when it was issued, I had people coming to me from other communities saying, "Oh, did you see what Trump did? He decided that Jews are a race."
Yeah.
And I said, no, they didn't do anything of the sort. Not everything is necessarily wrong because Trump does it. A lot of things, not necessarily. But I want to raise a point with you, Ken,
Sure.
which is, while it's possible to create an ideological construct in which we're separating out anti-Zionism from anti-Semitism, and as you rightly point out, there are Jews that are not big fans of Zionism generally. In the real world, as you look at these demonstrations, as you look at BDS, they are intertwined with anti-Semitism. They're so intertwined that it's hard to piece them out. And while I think you're right that on a lot of campuses things aren't as bad as they often are painted, they are bad on a whole bunch of campuses. And Jewish students cannot speak their minds. They are harassed, literally harassed on campuses. Sometimes the professors treat them in a discriminatory fashion. And any talk, if we talk about this purely as a free speech issue, which we ought to, we have to respect free speech and that freedom, without dealing with that reality, I think first of all, you're not going to get many sales within the Jewish community. But in addition, we're not dealing with the real problem that's out there. So what do we do about that? If we're going to be true to the ideal you hold out of free speech and academic freedom, how do we at the same time assure that Jewish students are not suffering discrimination and harassment that we wouldn't tolerate if other students were being tolerated in that way, were being harassed in that way on the basis of racism or some.
Yeah. Richard, I absolutely agree with you in terms of the goal, and there certainly are instances where bad things happen, and I outline a lot of them in the book too. I mean, the professor's refusal to write a recommendation for a student who wants to study in Israel. I mean, the whole idea of the academic boycott. I mean, there are tons of things that I see as problematic. I just don't see it as only happening on first of all, just to Jewish students. I see, this is also happening in a situation where people are not wanting to disturb students with trigger warnings, safe space, and there are complex things, and I go into the complexities in the book. But there's an attempt to feel that somehow students shouldn't be disturbed. I think it's a fundamental difference between hearing ideas that disturb you to the core and being harassed or discriminated against. And I think one can make those distinctions. And when we try to blur it, as I think the lawsuits did and the legislation did and the executive order does, in terms of putting things that are political speech as the guidepost for this, you're not looking at somebody being picked on simply because of who they are. I think it also does the community a disservice as we try to play the game that the other side does. They do the anti-normalization. We have the Hillel guidelines. You can't speak across these divides. That's being traitorous. That's, you wouldn't sit down with David Duke or a Nazi. How could you sit down with a BDS person, or how could you sit down with a pro-Israel person? I think we need to find ways, and using education in particular, to beat that back. I think you need to call out again, when there's harassment and discrimination, but again, to use the imagination of a different view of the conflict if you were born in different circumstances. I mean, one of the things that one of the people I shared the draft of the book with said to me, which really made me think, was, you know, I had to have a chapter that said, okay, what's this conflict about? So there's a chapter about, you know, Zionism and Herzl and the founding of the state and all that stuff. And then there's a Palestinian narrative. And she said to me, you know, you have to make a real important choice here about which one goes first, because that says a lot. And, you know, if you'd see in the book, I put the Zionist narrative first, because for lots of different reasons, but I have a long footnote. And I said, if you're, you know, a Zionist like I am, a pro-Israel supporter, imagine how you would have felt if I had started with the Palestinian narrative and brought in Jews as secondary characters as an obstacle to achieving their national dreams. You would feel disheartened. Fine, I think you have to be in a position where you say you have to navigate that discomfort, and the university should set that up rather than people seeing about suppressing, you know, the other side of that. I think that's a large part of what's missing there is the leadership of the university to say we ought to have these difficult discussions. I've worked at a couple of places where there was a desire to have those discussions, but people were afraid. We brought together, similar to what I did in Spokane, but, you know, Chatham House rules, faculty, students, including very active people on, you know, the pro-BDS side and very active people in the mainstream Jewish community to have these honest discussions. I think the more of that we can do and say that this is a, you know, exemplar of how you should use the campus to have these things, the less likely you're going to feed people into these boxes where they're trying to weaponize them to beat up the other side. And I think it'll make things more comfortable, not only for Jewish students, but for all students.
There is another question that I was asked to ask you.
Sure.
Melissa can, and that's to ask you about the future of the two-state solution,
Oy.
especially in light of Peter Reinhardt's recent statement that we have to realize the two-state solution is no longer viable. Now, I recognize that that's not really comes under our topic today, so, but.
I'll give you my 2 cents, which is really all it's worth. Look, I read Peter Singh. I respect him. He's a brilliant writer, and when he writes, it usually is, you know, it's a trend-setting thing for opening up lots of discussions in the Jewish community. I hope we do have those discussions. But I know people, including people like, you know, Derek Penzlar at Harvard, and others who are open to, you know, discussions about things other than just sovereignty for Palestinians and sovereignty for, you know, Jewish Israelis. So there are reasonable people who don't see the world as, you know, a Jewish conspiracy, who are anti-Zionist, who want to find a way. And that's, again, part of my point to why I don't like that equation, because there are people that have, you know, other objections to Zionism too. But you know, I don't know that there's any solution, frankly, but I find it very difficult to wrap my brain around the idea that somehow Jews are going to give up the capacity to protect themselves in their historic homeland, or that they should. Or that Palestinians going to give up their desire for sovereignty. And, you know, there's some social science. I think I have a paragraph in the, you know, in the book about what would make settlers and, you know, very active Palestinian folks want to see a solution. And the answer, you know, the answer was not what Kushner was proposing, is you throw money at the Palestinians, and that actually backfires. You can't buy off sacred symbols in your identity with money. That makes you feel like a traitor, and you know, it's a betrayal of your principles. But what would make them open, at least in that particular study, was to see the other side lose one of their sacred symbols, to give up on something that's part of their core. That would make them open to some sort of compromise. So, you know, I think both sides have to lose, and I still don't see a viable option other than the two-state solution, but I don't disagree with Peter that it gets harder and harder to see so many years after 67.
Yes. Any other questions anyone had?
Sure, I actually have a question. So what do you think then of the current debate over Facebook and all of these companies pulling their advertising because Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook kind of choose not to put all of their, you know, they don't really discriminate. They don't really take stuff off, supposedly, that is that they feel like is racist, or you get
Right.
the, like, what do you have, especially because obviously college students use Facebook a lot. Like, what do you feel about that?
Actually, college students don't use Facebook.
Oh, not anymore.
It's
Sorry.
it's for us old
Not
folks that use
anymore.
Facebook.
Now it's all
Right.
Instagram and
Yeah,
everything.
that's right, and TikTok and other things. You know, it's a very difficult question. You know, and there are lots of components to it, right? One is that, you know, Facebook and Twitter and these other social media companies have the right and, in fact, the obligation to have their own terms of service. So those terms of service can define, you know, what's allowable and what's not. And if you don't want to go there, then you go someplace else. You know, the challenge is, just like before we had social media and people were talking about hateful websites, there's always another place, you know, to go. So, you know, it's certainly possible for these groups to decide that they're going to limit certain types of speech. But you know, it's not like the stuff is going to disappear. I supervise a senior project on incels, which are, you know, and so it's really going to the dark web. There are places that you can find all sorts of things, and getting it off Facebook isn't going to mean it's going to disappear. And there's a downside to things too. I mean, Richard will remember too that back in '95, when the militia movement was 94, 95 was getting up to speed, and leading up to the Oklahoma City bombing. Part of the reason that a number of us were raising, red flags about this is going to happen, there's going to be an attack on government, these folks are planning, they have the means, was because they were, on then it was bulletin boards, but there was online activity that those of us could see that allowed us to have an analysis of that. And last summer, I had a student who was working with the Berlin Archives, which is a group that documents the atrocities in Syria, with the idea that later you can maybe bring people to the International Criminal Court. Part of their database was the videos that after Christchurch, the social media companies were taking down, so people were losing evidence. So it's a very difficult question, and the piece of it that I'm at the Bard Center for the Study of Hate, I think is under-focused, that once we can have an in-person meeting, I'm eager to get this set up, and if somebody has an interest, please email me, because I'm happy to include you with this. But the flip side isn't really looked at enough. How do we use social media more effectively to combat hate? And I'll give you one example where I think it has been used, and I think there are a lot of others that can be done too. You may remember a few years ago, right after the election, there were threats against the Jewish community in Whitefish, Montana, and the human rights community there. And there was an announced march of armed people. There are going to be skinheads coming up from Oakland. They're going to march in the community and really, up the harassment. And so what the human rights folks there, and I worked with them on this, what we did is we used social media to do what was called a Project Lemonade approach, which was really developed by a group in Western Pennsylvania in the late 90s that had a Klan rally. And they decided, okay, the usual things, what do you do a counter protest, you shut them down, you try to deny them permit, whatever. So no. What we do is we flip the free speech issue around, and we make them effectively fundraise for things that they would detest. So we use social media to get people to make pledges tied to how long this potential march would last, up to certain limits, and that money would go for things they detested: anti-bias education, protection for the Jewish community, hate crime training for the police, and so forth. It gave the people in the community the feeling that others had their back, and it gave people globally the capacity to do something other than just to bemoan the fact that something horrible is happening. There are other strategies out there, but they're getting sort of lost in the what should Facebook do and how should Congress regulate this. I'd rather focus on, okay, what can community groups and others do more effectively using this tool against hate? And that's my little slice of it.
That's It's really,
Any other questions that anyone has? Well, Ken, I want to thank you. And as one of the 400 college presidents, because I was then
Yes,
a president, who signed your that petition.
I remember.
I applaud all the work you've done. I'm sorry at the outset I didn't give your entire background, but that was 10 minutes. So I think people know who you are, and I think we have to continue. I agree, we have to continue to struggle to not let strong feelings overwhelm, which are understandable on both sides or each side, overwhelm the fundamentals of academic freedom and freedom of speech. And it's an ongoing struggle. So, and you're leading the fight in many ways, you and Richard and folks like yourself. So we thank you very much for sharing your ideas with us. And I do recommend to the folks who are still on, who are on this call, to read your book.
Thank you.
And it's well worth reading, and we just have to keep up the struggle.
Right, and
Academic freedom, I do believe that. I get, as the president of the AHLJ, I get a constant stream of requests to sign on to letters to presidents of colleges around the country, complaining about something that's going on the campus that it's anti-Semitic, you know, and I have to say that, and anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, and many of those things, I have signed on to a lot of the letters, but some of the letters I won't sign on to because I don't agree with the premises behind them. So each of us has to make our own decisions on these things, but sometimes I think there may be what I would call overkill.
And Steve, let me thank you and thank everybody. And I agree with you. There has to be, you know, consistent principles applied if we're going to have credibility when we do speak about anti-Semitism. And if anybody has any, you know, questions that you want to ask today, or if you have read the book and have questions, you know, feel free to email me. I'm kstern@bard.edu, and I'm happy to engage in any discussion. I'm particularly interested in hearing where people may disagree with me.
I think we also recorded this, right, Alyssa?
yes, thank you. I will get this recording out to everybody who registered. And if
to our members.
Yes, and if you have follow-up questions, you know, you'll be able to relay those to Ken. And thank you from the AHLJ. We really appreciate it, and please consider joining the AHLJ for those of you who
I should have put in that plug myself.
who have been enjoying our very frequent webinars that have been very interesting. All right, thank you.
Great. Thank you all. Good seeing you.
Have a good day.
Okay. You too. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.